Hello and welcome to Keep Middlesex Moving's podcast. And today we have a special guest with us from Discover Traffic Gardens. And we want to say hello to Fionnuala Quinn.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here.
And joining us in this conversation is Keep Middlesex Moving's marketing manager, Arlene Holt.
Hey, Chris. Hi, Fionnuala.
Good morning.
So today our special guest has collaborated with us over the last few months on an exciting project that we have in the township of East Brunswick. And what we've been doing on our end is working to develop a traffic garden for the township to hopefully have that installed in some space where kids can learn to use the streets for cycling and understand what all the signage and paint lines and what the infrastructure looks like that serves us and helps direct and keep us safe as we're using those spaces. But now I don't want to tell everyone all about it, and I don't want to spoil what Fionnuala has to say. But let's start with you telling us a little bit about yourself and how your journey brought you to discover traffic gardens.
Well, that's a long journey. And I have to start with, I did not grow up in the US. I came to the US as a newly minted civil engineer at age 21. I thought I was going to stay here a year. And I stepped straight into city government in Philadelphia. So it really was an unusual way to learn about a country that you'd never visited.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it always caused me to think about, why do we do this way here? And of course, I was a bit of a time traveler because I came from Ireland, and our transportation network was very different at the time. We had no highways. We had quarter of the number of vehicles per person as the US had at the time. Women couldn't drive for the most part, and it was completely normal to get around by bicycle. So my second purchase in Philadelphia was a bicycle, and then I learned, the roads don't work the same way. So but I developed a very strong interest in how the roads did work. And I worked my civil engineering work over into bicycling and pedestrian design. So I was working on that in a consulting role. And meanwhile, I was also doing a lot with children. In other forums, I had a junior engineer and training program for many years at a school close by, where I collaborated with what we would now call a STEM teacher, because I very deeply believed that children needed to see how the infrastructure was put together. Now, I'd had decades here, and I had thought a lot about how it was put together here, and there were aspects of it that I wasn't overly thrilled about, like some of the excessively wide roads and crossing them and stuff like that. So I had developed a lot of activities for children regarding our streets. And along the way, I also had realized something, that safety towns were a feature of the US. I too had gone to a similar type of facility as a child in my home country, and it had been like one of my favorite school field trips. I had gone to Clontarf Traffic School, which was a little world of streets where we biked and drove little pedal cars and acted as pedestrians, and just loved it. Had always stuck with me. And then in the course of my work here, stumbled upon a safety town in Virginia, Portsmouth Safety Town, and realized, there's a second one. Started looking into the topic and realized, there's safety towns scattered all over the US, and looked into their history, and sort of along the way realized, I actually, it's a concept that was being revived in the US in the last decade, but that nobody was actually focusing on it as their full-time role. And as a civil engineer, I realized, what that kind of meant was everybody was inventing their projects from scratch without the benefit of guidance or any sort of standards or anything.
Right.
So I thought there was a need to create the basic information people needed to do projects. So I left my role in a consulting firm and I set up my own business about 8 years ago. It was originally called the Bureau of Good Roads because it was supposed to be focused about, educating everybody about how our roads work and all this stuff. And after a few years, I realized people were more interested in the idea of traffic gardens, which are, these small worlds of roads, usually aimed at children. And I rebranded. Nothing really changed about my ideas or the kind of work I was doing. I just started to focus more on traffic gardens. And so I've been doing that for a number of years. Now, it's not that people hadn't designed or weren't designing traffic gardens in the US at the time, but they were all doing it as a once-off project because people had the skills through their work as designers in other aspects of design. And they would put together a traffic garden for their community, and that would be great. And there's some really well-known ones like White Center Traffic Garden in Seattle that was inspiring lots of people. But I thought we could have a lot more traffic gardens if we had the information on how to get started.
Right. Yeah.
And to make it a lot easier for people to do traffic gardens. So meanwhile, I was developing my practice of doing traffic gardens, but I was also developing the guidance. So started from, there was nothing, like I was looking for this material on the internet. It didn't exist. Now we probably have half a dozen pretty detailed guides in the US, and there's one that actually someone in Washington State has also done. So now there's quite a bit of guidance, and the deeper I got into the topic, I realized there were other things that people needed. So now you can go off and order stencils from transportation stencil making companies and stuff like that. And, just got it deeper into helping people put together traffic gardens. I never lost sight of the idea that I wanted children not just to have the experience of biking in traffic gardens, but that they would learn about design through traffic gardens. So they could be involved in the design process. And sometimes I've had some of those types of projects, or that there would be STEM materials or STEM activities in association with the traffic garden or in association with events at the traffic garden. So that whole vein of the work continues and keeps developing further also, because it turns out traffic gardens and the ideas around them are a great way to talk about the streets with children. So that's that's how I am where I am now. Sorry.
So one of the things I just want to touch upon is that we're using traffic gardens and safety town, and sometimes also it's described as a bicycle playground. So there are a lot of different names for this kind of project. And I just want to clarify that for our listeners.
Would you mind defining those for us?
Yeah, and that's a great point that I'd love to discuss further. So in 1938, a patrolman in Ohio created a small set of streets in, I think it might have been a parking lot. I've actually been to the site. It was painted streets, but he had little traffic signals and all that. And he called it a safety town. And he based it on a book called Safety Town Stories. And I actually have a copy of that book from the 1930s. So he came up with that name. He, simple idea, not very different to what we're doing now in East Brunswick, it spread all over. He got national attention at the time, and people copied him, and there were safety towns all over Ohio, and safety towns spread to different spots in the country, and you find them all over. And the place I had visited, I had first stumbled upon safety town was in Portsmouth Safety Town, that was a safety town. And they became more elaborate in many ways. They got curbs, and they needed drainage, and they had little buildings, and they became little cities.
Right.
And at the peak, there were hundreds of them in the U.S., and there was an organization, the National Safety Town organization. I'd have to look up exactly the name, that they were a part of. And then by the 80s, that seemed to peak, and a lot of them went away, and some of them stayed in place. The Hamilton Safety Town, New Jersey, is an example of a safety town, which again I've been to,
Right.
which has been going for decades. And it has those lovely streets and buildings, and it has a great companion program that goes with it. So some of those safety towns persisted.
Right. And I just want to point out, I'm sorry, I just want to point out that the East Brunswick Safety Town project was inspired by the Hamilton project. However, as you pointed out, the Hamilton project is a massive safety town facility with actual structures, buildings, classrooms. And this is more of a traffic garden, but for the purpose of the project, we are using Safety Town.
Yes. And you know, there seemed to be a sort of, even though safety towns were beloved in spots all around the US, there was a lack of general awareness that they existed. Like, I was working in bicycle and pedestrian design, and we didn't seem to know about them, even though, you know, we were obviously interested in that kind of work. And then in 2009, there was a federal highway study where a group of representatives from the US went to Europe to look at bicycle and pedestrian approaches, and they published a report about their tour. There were all these case studies, and they talked about a traffic garden in Switzerland. And they made recommendations in this federal highway document that this was the type of education we could consider in the US. And so they used the term traffic garden. And I still to this day read things like, oh, traffic gardens came from Europe to the US. And it's like, no, they were actually already here. And they were called safety towns. And but the language changed at that moment. And in the bike and pedestrian world, where people actually had the skills to also design and install these, there was a lot of people were inspired by that case study, and then some videos that were made about other European traffic gardens, and people started using the term traffic garden. Then so that worked its way in. Then I started working on this and trying to find all these installations all around the US, and I discovered actually the language was different all over the place. Safety towns had become Safetyville when they were bigger. Safety Village, you know, people had, and I actually think that this is part of why they were kind of lost. They didn't have a single term. So they were out there, but they couldn't easily be found. You couldn't find them on the internet easily. And in some places now, with the new terminology, traffic garden, people adjusted that, and it became traffic playground and traffic, you know, different variations of traffic. So I have about a dozen terms that are used in the US for these type of installations. So I feel like they need a collective term. So my collective term is traffic gardens. And then locally, whatever people call them, that's what we call them. So like obviously in New Jersey, there was knowledge of the safety town already. In some parts of the country, usually the West Coast, they're all called traffic playgrounds. So the names need to be seem to be a little regional. Collectively, now I've put them all under the same umbrella, and by treating them collectively as a thing, what's that's helping us do is now find them and look at them and include them together in different things. We've just finished sending a survey out to 180 installations that I was able to find in the North American continent. And I worked with Penn State University and also George Mason. We got, I believe, 50 responses. Everybody called them different things, but collectively we called it the North American Permanent Traffic Garden Survey, I think. And Penn State right now are analyzing all of that. Apparently it's a whole lot of information in it, and I'm looking forward to our first meeting next week to learn what was found. And the idea also would be is if they sort of are collectively under a single name, then we can start really getting into research, collecting data, and maybe even, dare I say, national federal funding stream. Yes. And things like that. If we can get them recognized as a thing. So as I say, collectively now I treat them as this thing because the traffic garden, because that was what federal government report called them, but locally, they have different names. But yeah.
As organizations like People for Bikes are funding projects like and I believe they call them traffic playgrounds, but also AARP. But you're right, it would be really nice to get some federal funding for it because I believe there is a need, especially with the work that we're doing at KMM and just creating this project for East Brunswick. There is definitely a need for funding.
Well, and there are some of us that are sort of working behind the scenes to try and make this happen. I mean, it's a dream. We're not close yet, but I will say we have a top federal official coming out next Wednesday on a bike with us to join us in a bike bus and to visit a traffic garden in Virginia and to hear from lots of people who've been involved in different projects. And so we're really hoping, and she's very interested because of the potential for this to be a real, national tool for children in terms of roadway safety. So we are working on it, trying to get the concept up to the highest levels.
Yeah, it's wonderful to hear.
Yeah.
Especially since you're getting them out on bike too, because that changes the perspective for folks significantly. Mm-hmm. But one of the things you mentioned earlier that struck me, not saying that this should be the term to move forward with and all, but when you described it as a world of streets, it sounded really charming. But at the same time, when I think about how our environment has been changing and everything that's going on around us, part of me doesn't want to live in a world of streets. But to have these spaces where kids can learn is absolutely wonderful. And another thing that stuck out to me was also including the children in the design of these spaces and allowing them to see how these different features, there's a cause and effect relationship. When you put one turn or traffic circle or signal in one place, it affects the movement of everything else that's happening around it. And for kids to learn that at such a young age is highly interesting to me. As someone who promotes safe routes to school and bicycle and education programs for kids. But can we go back to talking about the junior engineering program that you had mentioned earlier? And tell me more about what that looked like.
It was junior engineering training. It was 20 girls every year. You got kind of a golden ticket to be invited in. We capped it. And it was very design based. We were given a lot of freedom. The school itself was a arts and science magnet, and some of my children had gone there, so I knew it was a great school for doing interesting projects. They would give us the freedom. And the school was in Reston, Virginia, which, if anyone is familiar with sort of 1960s urban planning, that's a large, like 70,000 plus planned community that was planned around walking and biking trails and underpasses so that anybody didn't have to cross the street to get places. You can get everywhere by a trail. And the person, the visionary behind behind Reston was Robert E. Simon, or ES, that's where the name comes from. And he was still living in the community. He was in his upper 90s at the time. So we ran that program for about 10 years. And we invited him in annually to meet with our students, and they would present a project to him. And we actually also met him in the field. The last time he came in, he was 99. It was really amazing to have somebody like that who executed what is actually a very successful project. Reston has gone on to be a very successful community. He built it in a sort of a open green area at the time. People were like, that's too far from anything, but now it's a highly developed successful community. And to have him come in and look at their projects and make his comments, and he never held back. And he would sit and ask the kids, he'd look at their projects and then he'd say, how did you get to school? And like, how many of you walked? How many of you biked? And they, of course, most of them hadn't, even though the trails were all there. And he'd give them a lecture saying, I got all those trails so you could all walk and bike to school. And then I remember one year he said, the only thing better than walking or biking to school is riding your horse. The kids, the girls were like horses, we're getting horses. So it was a sort of a unique time. We also met him one year in the heart of the plaza. That's the heart of the whole design and very 1960s. And we just were very lucky, both like the school, the place, and our incredible luck that, not only was he still with us, but he was so generous in helping young people. So it was a very special time. Some of those girls are, I know at least one is in a PhD program right now, because they've grown up.
I was about to ask, where have they gone on since then? But
yeah.
astounding.
It was a great program, and it was really pre all the STEM all effort that we've seen nationally. And part of what I knew was I had grown up in a world where the previous generation had not gone to college. Almost nobody in my world went to college in the previous generation, and none of the mothers of anybody I went to school with had gone to college, maybe one or two, but it wasn't. And I knew that in my case, somebody had reached out to me at a critical point in time and said, oh, you could go to engineering school. The only person who had ever mentioned such a thing, and had invited myself and a few other girls over to a special program at the university. And three of us went on to engineering at that college. And I knew that sort of this simple act of saying to us, we could do this, was incredibly meaningful. So that was really the idea behind the whole program. I mentioned that the school was arts and science magnet. We actually reached out to girls who probably had been overlooked for various reasons, and they were invited in to the program. And it was really fun, but that was the idea. I do have to say, the three of us from my school that went on to engineering, and believe me, nobody had ever done engineering before, from any girls from our school. One of them now is the top transportation official in my home country. We're very we're very proud of her. So but it wouldn't have happened. She recently actually told that story when she received a top national award about the three of us, and how this act of inviting us to this space we would never have, we didn't know existed. We had never met an engineer. How powerful that act was.
Yeah, it truly is amazing. And in regard to the students who participate in the program and the wonderful things that they're doing. I'm glad to hear that it was such a success and that you were able to receive that feedback. Um, Now, as far as assisting communities and helping them design these spaces for themselves to learn and to practice and to understand the traffic situation, what is your role now, and how do you get involved with working more closely with them?
Um, it's always different. Even though traffic garden projects themselves are pretty straightforward, communities are very different, and projects all kind of are developed and appear in different ways. And I think because of my background in engineering, both I had worked both on the government side. I worked for a county government in New Jersey, and I worked for the city of Philadelphia, and then I worked on the consulting side. I was familiar with how we shape up projects and include people from different aspects of the community, or different government agencies. So we try and make it into a project that involves people in the input process, and that there is a process, and that it's shaped to what the community is thinking about and is interested in. Traffic gardens, what I call traffic garden, are a very flexible concept. So they very much can be an expression of what the group of people involved expresses. So I'm kind of been working to try and develop methods to capture that. And, sometimes it's very hands-on. It can be a hands-on workshop where I show up with, all the little parts and the design drawings, and people in the room are, testing them out and gluing them on paper. Sometimes it's a virtual process. It really depends. It has looked different everywhere. And as a consequence, the traffic gardens end up looking different. So, I mean, in theory, a lot of the sites are fairly similar. People often show up and they've got a pair of tennis courts or a parking lot. But the end result is looking different, and that's really to do with the process. So just projects appear in different ways. We're still at a stage where it's mostly people, champions, who know about this idea and who make it happen. So there's no standard way or method. Now that is starting to change, because in a few places, namely Seattle, DC, and Milwaukee, which I'm not involved in, there are traffic gardens going into every elementary school. They're going in through different processes. So it's a little more sort of a standard way of doing it, developing there. But for the most part, it's just been all different types of projects. I mean, I've come in and discovered there's already a traffic garden dream team, and they've been meeting, and then, I'm in. So it's very interesting for me as we work through the process. And then I'm thinking all the time about that site and, all that stuff.
You've made this profound statement about women in transportation and how much of a difference that your colleagues have been making. And we absolutely value your work and your cooperation with us too. And as for the junior engineering program, how did that program being targeted towards girls, and at what ages were they involved?
They were 5th and 6th grade, all girls. And as I say, they were invited in, and we wanted to manage it. And I have to say, in the first year, my daughter was invited, which was just for practical purposes. She was in 5th grade. And she turned the invitation down. She's the only person in the history of the program who turned it down. She was just like, oh, my mom doing engineering, like, how boring. And then it became the most popular program in the school, because we were doing really fun design things. We were doing these activities that were spread over a week or 2 weeks or a month. They could be anything. The school was letting us use the school. They said, we can't give you money for this, but you can use whatever you want in the school. We were using the school itself for all sorts of projects and building things and doing all sorts of stuff. And it looked like what we were doing was really fun, and the girls were having a lot of fun. And we were inviting a lot of guests in. And I was very much, because of part of, my background, which I've talked about a little bit, I knew engineering wasn't the most welcoming space for girls and women. And it's still a very, even though we've had all these programs, we still only have about 13% of practicing engineers in the US are women. So that is a clue. This is decades after I was, I graduated, that it hasn't adjusted right yet. So I wanted to make it very fun and, just welcoming, and looked like what we were doing was important. And as I say, we were inviting public officials in who were delighted to come in. I suspected they weren't getting these kind of invitations. We were doing other like random things, like sending Valentines to all our public works agencies and stuff like that. And that was triggering all sorts of stuff, because apparently they hadn't received Valentines honoring their work. And we were having fun, and every year the program was completely different, so nobody knew what to expect. And what was great for me was it was allowing me to develop lots of ideas, and it was also proving my kind of ideas and points that girls were great. They were interested, they loved it, they could enjoy it, and they could be really, they were receiving incredible sort of feedback from the adults around them for the stuff they were doing. Kind of important public officials were coming in and taking them very seriously and talking to them. And they were getting to go on field trips to, behind the scenes and stuff like that. So, we were going out on walking field trips and opening, having engineers open the traffic signal box so we could see how they were controlled. And, just doing all these random things. And they were having that feeling like, oh yeah, I could be an engineer. Obviously, there's lots to do. It's fun, it's interesting. And, so that was kind of the feeling we were trying to create, and it worked. So I knew that. And now that was obviously specifically targeted for girls. Right. In my work now, if you look at, I have lots of hands-on activities and design for kids. And I also have my website and my newsletter. And obviously I'm still in the engineering, let's call it quasi-engineering design field. And the work that I'm doing with children is, let's call it quasi-engineering design. It's absolutely design. Like we put them through processes where they have to do redesigns. They have to go to booths where we have engineers who review their work and approve it and give them permits and all sorts of stuff. But it has, I hope, it has an attractive appearance that is meant to appeal to all children. I do go to lots of large-scale STEM events just to see what people are doing. And I have to say, some of the activities, they will be surrounded by just boys, and I don't know what's really going on there, but there's something there that's saying this is for boys. And I really want everything to say this is for everybody. You too can be a designer. So that's part of what underlies why, if you ever see me out doing activities, there's all sorts of bunting and, cute colors and, cuteness in general going on. But that's part of what it's saying is like, yeah, everybody come and do these activities. And I think it works. I have girls love this stuff, like girls love design. So whatever messages are in the culture that are causing them to feel like it's not for them, I hope we are, we're addressing them somewhat. It's a much bigger problem. but trying to do our little bit to say design is for everybody and that we need you. I mean, very much when I go into these spaces, I say to them, like, we need people who look like you, and I'll talk about, just the profile of designers in the country and stuff like that.
Right.
That's
And I think
fascinating.
that's something beautiful about what you're doing with the traffic gardens is that you are engaging children in the process of design, because oftentimes we forget about the kids when we're designing these spaces. And just this morning, I was dropping my daughter off to school, and there's a road that's extremely dangerous. I would never allow my daughter to ride her bike there. And there were two kids her age going to school. And the only thing I kept thinking about is, oh my goodness, I hope that they get to school safely. So in that regard, I wanted to just stop traffic and let these kids, like drive on the opposite side, which is completely against what, bicyclists are supposed to do, but it's just more safer on the opposite side of the road. But when developing traffic gardens, take into account a child's perspective and the space that they're in, and you help them see the bigger picture. And I think that's beautiful because it gives them a sense of purpose and a realization that they have a voice and they can use it to create change.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's fabulous that you're creating such an inclusive learning space and introduction to engineering and planning for kids at such a young age, with the tools and resources that you provide on your website, with the interactive materials like the traffic garden kits. But I didn't think of it like that, how it could be such a wonderful introduction for everyone at such a young age. Mm-hmm. And it's not like when you think of the kids playing with trucks and other vehicles, but we don't always consider that them also playing with designing a space can affect what their careers or outlook might be, or understanding of the physical world in their communities. Mm-hmm. So that's amazing.
Yeah, because I may not see a child again, I want to make sure it's a memorable experience and plant these ideas. And some of what I do is I have these laminated lifetime traffic garden designer cards and stuff, and just say and notebooks and things, and I say, oh well, keep your notes in here when you see things about design, to try and make them see over time that they should be considering design, and that they too personally can comment and expect good design. I do think that because I was a child in a world where I got myself places. I was 4 years old when I started coming home from school by myself on the public buses. And my school was 4 miles from home. And I biked myself to school from 11 on and everywhere. I do feel like as a child, I learned in this natural way about public space and how it worked. Now, I lived in a world with far fewer cars, and cars where the balance was different. The cars, I realize now that the drivers were aware of our presence and were behaving as if we were there. And also the streets were older, they were narrow, speeds were lower. It could be like that. But I do think that that really there's a straight line from being a child living in a built world that I was navigating to the work I do now, and then thinking about, my own children, like how do they get that when they can't do what I did as a child? They might be materially much more rich than I was as a child, but they were poorer in terms of freedom and independence in the infrastructure. So how do you kind of correct that? Well, these are my little ideas for corrective stuff. It's part of just contributing to what children learn at their early ages.
Yeah. And let's see, with the communities you've worked with and the implementation of the traffic gardens and safety towns, have you seen the effects on trickle down from the installation of that project and how it's affected how community members use their public spaces and streets like in a positive way?
Well, it's still fairly early days. Like, I'm in a stage now where it's really starting to expand, but a lot of these projects, they were a first or an only, and there was no follow-on, there was no mechanism. But yes, I'm starting to see things, and in some places it's because I am going back, over the years with some follow-on projects, and then as part of the follow-on, I'm able to interview people and hear about the impact. I will say so, and I'm hearing what I had hoped to hear. And I will say that almost always, when there's a traffic garden project, and if there's any sort of public element, or children obviously doing design or anything like that, in a flash, people jump from looking at the traffic garden to suddenly saying, oh, well, we should do whatever around the school, or that, like, we need to make that safer. Like, it's a straight line from thinking about the traffic garden to realizing stuff about the wider built infrastructure. And again,
Yes.
That's exactly what I'm hoping for. I can't fix all that. I do, because I come out of a world where I was involved in that bike and pedestrian design. I'm trying to make sure I'm complementing the work that I know everybody else is doing. It's a very heavy lift that everyone's trying to do to make the infrastructure safer and all the things we need to do. I'm hoping that the work I'm doing is complementing and feeding into that. And yes, I have all sorts of conversations with people where maybe we're doing something about a roundabout, and you see, that gives me an opportunity to say something like, oh, well, roundabouts, they eliminate all the conflicts and they're much safer. And then, like, I might be talking in a certain way to the children, and then suddenly the adults around me are like, oh, I didn't know that,
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
it's because it's in a context of children, and I'm not actually coming in and building a roundabout on their street right at that moment. We can talk about it in this very friendly way. Now,
Right.
I did work in other roles where, discussion of the street wasn't so friendly. So that is part of what I have in mind here, which is, well, we do have a great difficulty sometimes talking about change on our streets, and those conversations are rocky, and a lot of people don't like change. I'm hoping that if we have a chance to talk about those ideas much earlier in a much sort of safer place, those ideas can set early. And then much later, when the child or perhaps their family member are in a setting where there is something proposed for their street or community, they might recognize these ideas and in the back of their mind reach in and say, oh, this is safer. We really do want kids to be able to walk safely down, that we can
Right.
sort of separate the ideas from the specific projects on people's streets. So that's embedded in all of this. Obviously, we'd have to go much wider to have a lot more influence, but I believe it works, and I certainly see anecdotally evidence that it does work.
And I'm sure with the Penn State study, there will be more information coming out on the effects of traffic gardens in communities and the types of design infrastructure modifications that are making as well.
And in that particular project, the next phase, once we analyze, or they analyze, I don't do that analysis, the results of the survey, there's going to be follow-on interviews. And so we're trying to build a base of understanding and knowledge, and just a way to talk about this concept in a broader way, and get a better understanding of how it works. And then if you understand it, then you can improve it. Like, if you have a better understanding, you can say, well, these are the parts that really are effective, try and get to where we could really use this tool. So it's fantastic that Penn State and George Mason University are figuring out how to do the research, because it's not as straightforward as it seems, I've learned.
Right.
But it's, I think, super important, starting to really build this base of just understanding how we can use this effectively, and then everybody can learn from all of that.
Throughout all of your work with the traffic gardens and with the communities, is there a specific memory or anecdote you have that really sums up your satisfaction with the work that you've been doing?
I will say, not so much a specific, but one of my favorite days is always the ribbon cutting. They are such fun. So far, every one of them, the sun has shone. Because, and I really emphasize, like, that really don't miss the opportunity to do it, because it brings everyone together. It's very much, cut that ribbon. We sort of use the symbolism of what we use on the public streets for big infrastructure, but using the traffic garden and having children with adults at the ribbon and everybody cutting it together. And then, what we usually do is have like a group of small children then bike through the ribbon that has been cut and go around. And it is just such a great moment. And having, all these people from all these different aspects of the community, like often like parks and public works and transportation and schools, everybody together wanting these good things for our community and our children. And then there's one particular moment where it was exactly that scenario. And the school superintendent was present. The ribbon had been cut. The small children were just riding off into the new traffic garden. And somebody had arrived at the ribbon cutting on an electric bike share bike. And he just turned around and grabbed the bike share bike and biked off with the 4-year-olds, who were all on balance bikes. He entered the moment. Now, everybody loved it, like the school superintendent going around with the tiny kids, everyone except for me, because it was all carefully planned and choreographed and practiced in advance with the 4-year-olds. We never planned an e-bike with the school superintendent in the middle, and of course all the media watching. And so I didn't enjoy it in real time as much as everybody else, but in retrospect, it was the most wonderful thing. And it was really like the school superintendent saying, this is for our kids, this is our way forward. So that particular moment, although I didn't enjoy it at that moment, was, in reflection, was one of my favorite moments. But yeah, they're all like, there's lots of really fun moments. Those are the great days, because it's kind of a fun project when it's completed.
Fionnuala, it was really great talking to you, and I sincerely appreciate all the work that you have done to help us with the Traffic Garden, aka Safety Town project in East Brunswick. I sincerely hope that we can one day soon join together in cutting a ribbon on the East Brunswick Safety Town project, and just presenting this to our communities. If we are successful, this would be the first, I believe, traffic garden in New Jersey. There is no other one aside from the Hamilton's PAL, right?
Yep. Not that I know of. I look all the time and I haven't found anything else. There are some traffic garden kits that go around, but they're something slightly different.
Yes.
But yeah,
so thank you.
It's very exciting.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you to all our listeners. Chris, thank you so much for being here with us and providing your insight. And we will see you on our next episode of Mobility Matters podcast. Thanks, everyone.
This ad is disseminated under the sponsorship of NJTPA and FHWA in the interest of information exchange.